Welcome to the Friday Transportation Seminar. My name is Leming Wang, and one of the co-hosts of the seminar this term. Today we're very pleased to have Chris Muhs with us. Chris is a Ph.D. student at Civil and Environmental Engineering at Portland State. And today he will talk about the development of a pedestrian demand model for the metro. So with that, I will give the floor to Chris.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So the title of the presentation is The Development of a Pedestrian Demand Estimation Tool, and today I'm talking about the destination choice model aspect of this. So before I get started, I'd like to acknowledge Dr. Kelly Clifton. She's the PI on this project, and we've got Patrick Singleton is a Ph.D. student in civil engineering here, who I've been working with a lot on this project, and also Dr. Bob Schneider, who is at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And I'm presenting this work at the TRB Planning Applications Conference in Atlantic City, New Jersey, which starts on Sunday. So you guys should be thankful that you get the sneak peek. So, some background on this project. So, some motivations for why we want to model pedestrian travel are first and foremost to plan for pedestrian investments and to plan for the investments in non-motorized facilities. Next, a big motivator is that we want to account for mode shifts as we make more investments in this types of infrastructure. And also, we want to account for pedestrian trips when we estimate greenhouse gas emissions. Next, there are health and safety applications that we can use the tools that we're developing here to address these issues. And lastly, we have been lately creating better data on travel behavior, but also more detailed data on the spatial environment. So we want to capitalize on this new information and develop tools that are in line with that. So what I'm talking about today is the second phase of two projects that we have been working on with Metro, which is our regional government here. They've been sponsored by Trek, and basically Metro has a trip-based travel demand model that estimates travel demand for all modes. What we're doing in phase one is that we have taken pedestrian environment data and also changed the scale of operation of this model to be suited to walk trips. And we have developed a pedestrian demand model out of this. The two main outputs that we've gotten so far from this effort has been a mode choice model where we've learned more about the influences on walking behavior. And what I'm talking about today is the destination choices from this effort. So this is what Metro's trip-based model looks like right now. And so on the right side of the screen, we've got the four classic steps of a four-step travel demand model. So trip generation, trip distribution, mode choice, and assignment or route choice. And in Metro's model, these steps operate at a scale that's called the Transportation Analysis Zone, or TAZ. So in Metro's current model, we don't know anything about walking until we have outputs from the mode choice model, and that gives us origins and destinations for walk trips, but the geographical unit is the TAZ. And TAZs are relatively large if we're going to think about walking travel. So what happens is a good amount of pedestrian trips are within the same transportation analysis zone, so we can't get as much information on them as we might like. This diagram shows what our projects have been doing. So we first changed the scale of analysis from the TAZ to a PAZ, which is what we're calling a pedestrian analysis zone. I'm going to talk a little bit more about PAZs on the next slide. And then, so we estimate trip generation at this fine geographic scale. And then the next immediate step is to estimate a model to predict a walk mode split. So from this, we get walk trips and non-walk trips. And the non-walk trips, we can then aggregate back up to the normal TAZ scale, and they can proceed through Metro's subsequent models as normal. And what we do with the walk trips is with the walk mode split model, we've got origins of walk trips, and what I'm explaining today is the destination choice is how we predict the destinations of those trips. And then after that, we'll have origins and destinations of pedestrian trips, similar to how Metro has them now, but at a much finer scale. A little bit more about the pedestrian analysis zones. So on the graphic, on the left we have TAZs, and on the right we have PAZs. And the example that the graphic is showing is the output of trip generation. So we can see that with the smaller smaller scale PAZs, we're getting a lot more resolution in our data. And the PAZs are 1/20th of a mile on each side, so 264 feet on a side. So that corresponds to about the size of a city block in downtown Portland. So if we think about this as far as walking behaviors, if we assume that it takes someone 20 minutes to walk a mile, then it takes someone 1 minute to walk across the span of a PAZ. In our phase 1 of this project, when we did the walk mode split, one of our key variables was what we call the pedestrian index of the environment, or PI. And so PI is an index that you can have scores between 20 and 100, and it's based on 6 dimensions of walking activity that we calibrated based on observed walking activity that we found in our data. So the first dimension is population and employment density. The next dimension is transit access. The third dimension is what's called urban living infrastructure, and this is access to the kinds of destinations that you would use in your everyday life. So some examples are grocery stores, banks, convenience stores, and dry cleaners, and there's plenty others. The next dimension is block size. So in the literature, we know that smaller blocks are more conducive to walking. And then we've got sidewalk coverage of links on our network. And then we've got access to what we're calling comfortable facilities. So this is an indication of low traffic volume streets. So this is what PI looks like on a map for our region. So we're seeing the highest values located in downtown Portland, and then kind of the next immediate highest values are in the northwest neighborhoods, and then we see kind of the next set of values are kind of located along inner east side Portland, and kind of gradient. There's like a gradient going outward from there. So this is a little hard to kind of picture what it might look like. So I've got some photos to help illustrate it. So when you've got a PI score of 100, you're in the downtown core of Portland. If we go down to a score of about 80, then we're looking at places that are kind of like the Lloyd District. If we go down to a 70, we've got the downtown areas of our inner suburbs. So I think this photo is from Gresham. When we get down to a 60, we're seeing kind of the single-family bungalow-style neighborhoods that are ubiquitous on the east side. When we get down to a 50, we're seeing places that are located in the suburbs that have hubs of activity, so that's kind of putting us in like a shopping mall type of context. When we get down to a score of 40, we're looking at suburban neighborhoods and subdivisions where the street connectivity is not so great and the blocks are probably a lot bigger. When we get down to a score of about 30, we're looking at isolated land uses. So light industry is an example that we saw a lot of as a 30. And then when we get down to closer to 20, we're seeing undeveloped land or very rural land or forests. So again, with phase 1, we estimated a walk mode split model to get walk trips and non-walk trips. To do this, we used a binary logit model where the probability of a walk mode choice is based on a function of traveler characteristics of the individual and then characteristics of the environment. We used data from 2011. It was the Oregon Household Activities Survey, and we had about 4,000 walk trips in that data set and that corresponded to about an 8% mode split in the overall data. If we look at the results from phase 1, we'll do questions at the end. I don't recall, but I think we're going to hold the rest of the questions till the end. So in our results, we saw positive impacts on walk mode split from the number of children, and we saw negative impacts of walk mode split for older travelers and for households that had vehicles available. With respect to our pi variable, we used pi to represent the pedestrian environment, and for our models, of which we had 3, we estimated models for 3 separate trip purposes. We saw increases of between 3.5% and 5.5% for every additional score of pi. So today, the focus is on destination choice. All that information is just kind of the background that's relevant for this study. So for our destination choice model, what we're doing here is, like I said in the beginning, we're trying to estimate the destinations of trips for which we've already estimated the origins. There's many different ways to do this. Some of the more classic methods are gravity models or growth factors. I'm not going to really talk much about those, but the key advantage of doing a destination choice model is that you get to include characteristics of the traveler. So arguably, it's a more behaviorally sound method to do this process. So destination choice models are a type of discrete choice model. So we're estimating the probability of choosing a particular zone as a destination, and that's based on a function of the impedance to get there, a function of its size or attractiveness, which is measured in the number of jobs or number of destinations in that zone. Also includes households sometimes. And then we're also including pedestrian environment variables in this decision, and also characteristics of the individual. So to do this, we're using our OHAS data again. So again, we have 4,000 walk trips. We're using a multinomial logit model to do this with random sampling for alternatives. And we're using what's called a super pedestrian analysis zone. I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. And we do models for 6 trip purposes. Now, some of you might be familiar with multinomial logit models for mode choice. The key difference between mode choice and destination choices is that in a mode choice problem, you know the number of alternatives that a traveler is facing. So, well, you at least can get a pretty good idea given some circumstances. So in a mode choice model, you're going to have walk, bike, car driver, car passenger, and then transit modes maybe. For a destination choice problem, the key difference is that the analyst doesn't really know all of the possible destinations that a person is thinking about visiting. So very rarely do we have data about their choice process and like the types of places that they considered when they chose a particular place to go. So there's a lot of literature about this and a lot of different opinions. So the way we are approaching this problem is a more simple method. So we're using random sampling. So we take a random sample of 9 zones surrounding the origin, all within a distance of up to 3 miles, I think it was. So we're grabbing 9 random zones, and then we grab, for the 10th one, the zone they actually went to in the data set. So hopefully I didn't make that overly confusing, but that's what we're dealing with here with this problem. It's definitely some very technical stuff. Back to our spatial unit for this problem. So this map is a sub-area of our region. This is a Northeast Portland transportation analysis zone in red, and then we see our pi scores, which are shown at the PAZ level. This is what it looks like at our super PAZ level. So our super PAZs are just aggregations of the individual ones. So a super PAZ is 5 PAZs on a side. So it's a gridded network again, but each cell is a quarter mile on its side instead of a 20th of a mile. And so this is what it looks like when we look at the average pi scores. Going back, here's our PAZs, and going forward, here's our super PAZs. The reason we did this was because there are about 1.5 million PAZs in the data, and when we do this slight aggregation, it reduces it to about 60,000, so it's a much more manageable amount for computations. Looking at our model specification, we built these models incrementally. So what that means is that we started with what we deemed as the key variables, and then we tested additional variables incrementally. So our key variables, again, were impedance, which was the network distance between origin and destination zones. And then the attractiveness or size variable was the number of jobs within a zone, and in some cases, the number of households in the zone. And the number of jobs were categorized by their different classifications. For additional variables that we tested, the key ones of interest were the pedestrian environment variables. So we used pi, just like in phase 1 of this project. And pi is in this case a measure of a supportive pedestrian environment. We also wanted to test things that might detract from the walking environment. So we're calling those pedestrian barriers. And we included things like slope, busy traffic crossings, and presence of freeways to measure those. And of course, traveler attributes were included as well. I'm going to walk you through the results of our models next. So we estimated these models for 6 purposes. Those are shown in the green row of this table. And here we're just looking at the sample size and a measure of model fit for each of these. So we're seeing sample sizes above 300, so they're pretty good, but we might not be getting a whole lot of statistical power on some of these. If we're looking at model fit, we're seeing pseudo R-squares that are all greater than 0.4. So compared with some destination choices we see in the literature, this lets us know that we're doing all right. Now I'm going to show you the results of the key variables. So text in red are things that negatively impact destination choices for the walk trips, and the regular black text is positive influences. So let's start with distance. So it's not shown here, but distance explains the most variation in all of the models compared with any of the other variables. So distance is the key driver of destination choices for walk trips. The 4 rows below the top one are interactions. So that's how we include traveler characteristics in the multinomial logit model, is we have to interact them with something else. So what we're seeing here is that auto ownership and the presence of children in the household have an effect on distance for pedestrians. So if you have a vehicle in your household, you are more sensitive to distance than if you do not. So this kind of makes sense with some intuition. And another similar effect we saw was that if you have a child in your household, you're more sensitive to distance for shopping and recreation purposes than if not. When we look at our size terms, we're seeing that the number of destinations in the potential zones increases the odds of choosing a particular one. So the key thing that stands out here is that the coefficient on our retail, our home-based shopping model, is a lot larger than the coefficients for size terms on all of the others. So this is driven by the number of retail jobs in a potential zone corresponding to the odds of choosing a zone for a shopping purpose. When we look at some of our additional variables that I mentioned, if we start with the pedestrian supports, we see that the average pi score in a zone increases the odds of someone choosing it as a destination for 4 of our 6 purposes. And these coefficients are actually kind of comparable to the results we saw in phase 1 of this work where we're looking at walk mode choice, which is kind of just an interesting note to make. When we look at barriers to walking, we see less consistent results. So we tested the average slope in a zone, the number of major arterial crossings in the zone, and the presence of freeways in the zone. And we saw for some purposes that these things detracted from the odds of choosing it as a destination, but the major arterial crossings had a positive effect, and we don't have a good explanation for that quite yet. We also developed another variable to measure a barrier to walking, and we were thinking that industrial land uses might deter destination choices. When you think about some industrial uses, typically a lot of big machinery, a lot of big buildings, single stories, large land areas might not be great for walking. So we developed a measure that was the proportion of industrial employment to total employment for all of the zones. And this one, we found that for 4 of our 6 trip purposes, it did deter destination choices for pedestrians. So that's all great, but the question remains, like, what can we do with these models? So I'm going to present a couple of example interpretations that we can do. So let's say we are policymakers and we're faced with the option to increase the amount of destinations in a particular area. We want to know how's that going to affect destination choices. So on the top left of this slide, we've got an example super PAZ zone, and we're going to say we're going to double the amount of destinations. We're going to double the amount of businesses and households. So on the right, in red, let's say that's what this looks like afterwards. What we can do with our model is estimate what the equivalent effect of a distance reduction would be based on this policy change. So the bar plots on the bottom of this chart, or the bottom of this slide, are for 3 example trip purposes. And what we're seeing is that if we double the number of destinations, or if we double the attractiveness or size of a destination, that's equivalent to reducing the trip distance that a person would take to get there by between 0.14 and 0.19 miles. We can do this again for an example of increasing the pi score of a particular area by 10 points. So the output of our model gives us the increase from a pi score of increase of 1, but it's kind of hard to picture what it really means as far as changing policies. So if we take an area that's, let's say, a pi score of 75, like in the top left of this slide, and we make some policy changes and make it a place that's got a pi score more like 85, which is in the top right, what we're seeing is that this is equivalent to reducing the trip distance by a little bit over 1/10 of a mile. So this is a couple example interpretations of what we can do with this, with these models, and to do this is just kind of a simple manipulation of the coefficients and comparing ratios. So I didn't really mention this in the beginning, but what we've done here is one of the first studies ever to examine the destination choices of pedestrians. And the way we've done it is pedestrian scale analysis, and we're including variables that are relevant to pedestrian travel. As far as our findings go, we saw that distance and size or zonal attractiveness had the most influence on destination choices, but that the measures that we operationalized in terms of supportive pedestrian environments and barriers to walking also had some influences on the choice. And then we saw that certain traveler characteristics moderated the effects of distance. So in the future, some things that we'd like to do is address our method of choice set generation and the number of alternatives that we sample. So there's some debate in the literature about how these 2 things might affect the stability of your results. So that's something that we're planning on looking into. And then we can also explore some nonlinear effects of distance on destination choices and also some more nuanced interactions between variables. Another immediate thing that we're going to do is validate this model. So we've set aside some of the OHAS sample to validate our model, and then we also want to apply this with Metro. So Metro, we had a conversation with them last week, and they are interested in kind of taking our phase 1 and phase 2 work and developing a trip-based model that actually incorporates our framework that I presented at the beginning of this. So they want to like implement this, which is pretty neat. So we need to do an application in order for them to be ready for that. Another thing that we can do in the future with this work is, since we have predicted origins and destinations on this raster geography, we can kind of explore the potential routes that people might be taking between origins and destinations. So because it's a raster geography, we can use some rule of thumb, like we can say all of the cells that are within, let's say, 3 cells wide of the straightest line between origins and destinations, these are the potential places that people might be walking to get from origin to destination. And we can do some exploration of what kinds of things are along these potential routes and see how that affects people's behaviors. I know there's some other research here at PSU about pedestrian route choices, so it would be neat to approach it from this angle, which is kind of a little bit different from how a lot of travel modelers might think of it. Another thing that we have considered is applying our whole framework in another place. So our Pi score, which I showed, is calibrated for the Portland region. So right now you wouldn't be able to take this measure of pi and go take it to another region and say, here's what your pi score is at this location based on all this stuff. You have to kind of recalibrate it. So we're interested in thinking about how that could happen, and partnering with someone is certainly something we've been talking about to do that. So that is the conclusion of the presentation. If you're interested in reading more about phase 1 or phase 2 of this work, the URLs are listed here. And I'd like to acknowledge Dr. Kelly Clifton, the PI on this project, and Patrick Singleton, a Ph.D. student in civil engineering, and also Bob Schneider of University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee for all their assistance on this project. And I'd like to acknowledge Trek for funding the research and Metro for partnering with us. And with that, we can go to questions. Yes, in the back.
Violet Brown. At the end, you mentioned that in the future, you would want to look at the more nuanced interactions between variables and possibly nonlinear effects. One of the things that jumped out to me on Pi was the comfort variable that you discussed, and you kind of equated that with low traffic. And it jumped out to me that actually too low traffic starts to feel maybe unsafe, particularly for a woman walking alone. So you might choose something more medium. Is that something that could be incorporated? Or
That's a very interesting point. I think there might be a way to do that. I'd have to think it through. I don't really have like an easy answer for you right now. Yes, in the back.
Your pi scores vary from, say, walkscore.com. And so you mentioned that yours is calibrated differently. Can you sort of help me understand how that works?
Sure. So you're interested in what makes it different from WalkScore? Is that correct? So to my understanding, WalkScore is mostly based on access to different types of destinations. As I introduced, the Pi score has 6 different dimensions of which it's based on. And what we did was we calibrated each one of those, we weighted each one of those dimensions to observed walking activity that we saw in our data set. So we estimated 6 separate mode choice models with each of those in it as the key variable. And so based on that, we could see how certain dimensions equate with walking activity separately, and then we weight each one of those based on that individual result to get the compound score between 20 and 100. So I'm not sure whether walk score does some statistical thing like that to actually calibrate their measure with actual observed walking. So I'd say that's the key difference. Yes?
Just in response to the question about lowering traffic and comfort, pedestrian comfort in relation to traffic, I think that you can also think about sidewalks or buffer areas as kind of a way of safely separating pedestrians from traffic. And so in essence, that is, to some degree, lowering traffic when you have adequate walkway facilities.
Yeah, that's another interesting point. So, we have the sidewalk connectivity measure within PI, so that's a little different than what you're suggesting. I think what you mentioned, separation from traffic, would have a lot to do with the transportation and land use context of a particular road segment. So you might want a lot of separation from traffic if you're on, a busy arterial as compared to something downtown. So that's another key challenge of making measures like this, is that you have to kind of account for all the different types of land use transportation contexts that you're going to see, and certain treatments on one are going to have a different effect on others. Again, yeah.
I have a question about how you're defining your population. Are you using strictly census data, or do you actually look at individual trip generators, like grocery store, healthcare facilities, et cetera? And if you do use those trip generators, how are you then defining the populations within them? Is it patrons, et cetera?
So Metro provided the base data for population and employment. And to my understanding, population was based on census data or survey data that they had done for the whole region. For the employment, I believe that was from Esri Business Analyst data, I'm pretty sure. And so that would be kind of like a survey of individual businesses. So we didn't really do it from individual trip generators, per se. Yeah, we didn't. It wasn't that. No. Yeah, in the back.
Thanks. I was very fascinated by your idea of looking at paths going forward, and I thought in the context of there are certainly neighborhoods, especially in East Portland, where a single maybe a high capacity road could cut off two neighborhoods that are decently walkable. So, in theory, you could find those individual barriers. And just kind of from a policy implementation point, do you think we could ever get to a point where we could have fine enough detail to find out, okay, these are some neighborhoods that would be super walkable except for these individual barriers, and those could be the kind, in a sense, to prioritize. If we have $1 million to improve pedestrian barriers, we've identified these individual places. Is that kind of too fine-grained, or is that something where you might see a couple years ago to tell?
I think that is definitely within the realm of possibility based on what we're doing here. I think absolutely, like that's one of the reasons that we're doing this project is to be able to say things at the fine-grained scale. I think as far as the potential paths and finding kind of things that stand out and like will deter walking activity. Sure. Yeah, I think that's definitely within the realm of possibility for what we could do with this tool. Yes. In the front.
Yeah, Kevin, right? So I think you answered this, but the data you got, that was from Metro. Because my question was literally how do you actually collect the data?
Okay, yeah. So yes, the data were from 2011 statewide travel survey. So I think it was done. I think it was monitored overall by an ODOT type of body, but then it was for each of the 6 regions in the state. So for ODOT's Region 1 is the Portland region. So Metro was in charge of I think, handling the survey. So yeah, it's like a kind of a standard household travel survey where they interview a sample of households and gather travel information on them for a day or two. Yes?
Andy Payne. Considering how fast the city is changing, what do you feel is an appropriate kind of shelf life of this model before you'd have to make a major update to it, considering all the nuance in the zones?
That's a great question. So we started this work in 2011, and already there's a lot of things on the ground that are different than what our built environment data are describing. So I don't have a clear answer of 3 or 5 years or something like that, but the idea is that so long as the spatial data is being updated at a reasonable interval, it should be able to account for changes that are happening on the ground. And I think, well, I know that Metro is pretty good about releasing updates to our lists and these types of spatial data fairly frequently. So it's hard to answer your question, but I think I don't think at least as far as the dimension of what things look like on the ground and what they look like in the data set for the spatial data, I don't think that's so much of a problem. Yes?
Justin Sherrill. You said that one of your data tables said that there was the age had a negative relationship with inclination to walking. Mm-hmm. And was that relationship basically like geometric, like just standard, like going forward decades you're less and less inclined, or was there a bracket where all of a sudden it just kind of jumped up?
That's a good question. Off the top of my head, I don't recall how we included that in the model, but my hunch would be that you will reach a certain age and then you start to see a decrease in walking in the data. There are a lot of options of how to account for a non-linear relationship in that, but I don't recall what our sample sizes looked like and how we did that. I think if you did want to really find out this first URL, you could probably look at the report and check.
Okay. I have some online questions.
Okay.
So here is one that the question is: you mentioned that the size of PAZs 1.5 million. So that means that there are quite a bit of them actually may not have any population living in there at all. So in that case, how are you going to model them, for example, and then what are the implications for development?
That's a good question and a good point to raise. So the outputs of our phase 1 work were trip productions at PAZs. So we only did that for PAZs that had households in them. So theoretically, we wouldn't be dealing with PAZs that don't have any households in them at this stage of our modeling work. So when we apply this model, when we apply this series of models, we won't be dealing with zones with no households in them. So that's definitely a limitation of this work, but I think that's also a function of the trip-based modeling structure that we're operating in. But definitely a good point.
Another question is the availability of public transportation. Is that a factor in the PI calculation?
Yes. So access to public transportation within, I think, a quarter mile is one of the 6 dimensions. So yes. One up here.
Yeah, I have a question. A lot of people are interested in children's travel, especially travel to school. That's what they say for us, the school program, making it safe for people to walk and bike. Did you look at home to school trips, walking trips, in your destination choice model?
No, we did not examine destination choice for school trips because it's kind of a different problem. So schools have fixed locations, and they vary a lot by, well, at least in Portland Public School District, students are not required to go to the nearest school. They have a different system where you can kind of opt into certain schools that might be across the district or across the city. So we didn't have good information on our schools, so we didn't really look at that in this effort. It's definitely an interesting area for future work, though. And I think I remember having a conversation with Metro that they face this problem with their regional model as well, and they have a much simpler way to deal with school trips than the nuanced discrete choice methods. Yes.
I'm interested in how do you score your PIE for each PAC? Do you get a PIE for each PAC?
How do we score it?
I'm interested because there are a lot of PAC, and the PIE have 6 dimensions, and I think the dimension may be decided by manually need people decision, and how there are so many PAC, and you need to calculate PIE for each PAC. So I think how do you score it? Does it manually or can calculate?
Yeah, so it's a straightforward calculation. So for each of the 6 dimensions of the environment, it's just a factor plus the value for each of those 6 dimensions. And then that's how we get the resulting score between 20 and 100.
Do you need to decide by people or just can get data for each PhD?
It's based on empirical data, so it's based on spatial GIS data.
Person decision analysis?
I don't believe so. I think it was all like objective and empirical.
And another question is, I'm very interested in, you mentioned that your model may be your virtual work, incorporate your model to metro model, and your advantage of your model is based on PAC, and CSA is also your motivation for your model, but metro model is based on TAC. And when you correlate your model to metro model, how you balance your advantage of PAC to TAC?
So to balance that, it would be kind of a separate thing. So I'll open up the slide. It'll help explain this. So this slide, it illustrates how this would work when it's implemented. So after we do the walk mode split model, this one, so we've already done trip generation at the PAZ. We do the walk mode split, and for the non-walk trips, we aggregate them back up to their TAZ geography. So it kind of goes back to the scale that Metro typically uses for this analysis, and then they can continue separately. We're only dealing with the PAZs at that point for pedestrian trips. So we get the more fine-grained outputs for walk trips, and then they get the regular outputs for the non-walk trips. Christy?
For this was actually the page I was thinking about, but when you were talking about this, you showed us the 4-step, the general 4-step, where people decide to make a trip, they decide where they go, they decide what mode, and then what route to take. And here you're sort of assuming that people are going to first decide whether they're not going to walk, whether or not they're going to walk, then they're going to make a destination choice, and then anybody else who's not going to walk is then going to make a second mode choice, or just at least within the model structure. Could you talk a little bit about those assumptions?
Yes. That is something that we have, something that reviewers have identified in the past about this new proposed method. So they argue that it doesn't make behavioral sense to say that people are going to choose their mode, whether or not to walk, before they would choose something else. And to an extent, I definitely sympathize with that argument. But we, in order to do our projects, we deemed that this was the most appropriate way to do it. So we could spend a long time arguing about, the sequence of how people make decisions with respect to their travel. Maybe, they choose the route first and then they decide other stuff. Maybe they decide modes before destinations. All these things, in real life, they're kind of like intermingled, and it's really hard to tell apart. So back to your question. The reason why we did the walk mode split model as the second step was just so that we could have a way to just be dealing with pedestrian trips at one point in time, rather than doing destination choice for everything and then doing mode choice for everything at the PAZ level. It made things a lot simpler to just have this immediate step where it all got separated.
How might your work here be translated to an activity-based system?
Another good question. So I think one of the most immediate ways that we, based on our work, would be able to contribute to an activity-based model is through the destination choice step. So we haven't really thought about how this whole method fits in, but I think that some of the model structure aspects of our destination choice model could help inform that step in ABMs. Yes?
Explain a bit about your unit analysis. How are you transferring back and forth between OHAS data and PAZ? Because PAZ is the geography, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then when you're looking at OHAS, it's basically individuals, household person. And then when you estimate a destination choice model, are those models for individual household person, or are they for PAZs?
Those models are for individuals within households within PAZs.
So, but then you're not estimating one destination choice model for each PAZ.
I am not sure, to be honest with you. It would either be for, I'm not sure, because certainly when you have households with multiple people, you would have multiple destination choices occurring in the same zone. So I'm not sure. I have to double check.
And also I have, certainly that's probably limited by data available. I suppose, for example, the presence of pets may be a pretty strong predictor for those kind of home-based recreational trips, but none of those data is available as it is.
Right. Yeah, I think there's a study that argues that, or shows that having a dog increases your, walking activity like tenfold or something like that. But yeah, we didn't have that information available to us.
Also, comments to the question that raised during your talk about whether the 8% pedestrian trip is seasonally adjusted or not. I think they're not. Right? If it's directly from OHAS data, then it's just that 1 day actually, 1 day. In between sometime May 2011, the cross-sectional for that period when the person or when the household was surveyed.
Right. Yeah, so maybe not. I can't recall.
Those kind of statistics from different data sources probably have quite a bit of variation. I suppose, for example, census, we don't know actually now whether it's as equal pedestrian walking at all as a separate category.
that will have some variation because supposedly they are seasonally adjusted for the whole year compared to OHAs where we only have a very short cross-sectional in May, April or May. I actually interesting answer. Any other questions? Okay, actually, let me double check whether I have a few last online questions. I do have one about how, whether you can comment about how the pedestrian demand model can be incorporated with health impact assessment application, and then what justification or what adjustment may need to use these tools.
I think there is definitely an opportunity to include it within health impact assessments. I think one of the key advantages that this tool offers to that is the finer spatial scale. On what adjustments are required to incorporate it, I can't really speak to that. I don't have as much expertise in those areas, but I know Patrick made a presentation at a health and transportation conference, and there was definitely some interest in health professionals on that idea.
Okay. Questions? If not, let's, before we thank Chris for his talk, we have, next week we have a talk about the new Federal Highway Administration mileage estimation and its implication for local planning. And then with that, let's thanks Chris for a great talk.